Ken Miles should have been a household name. Instead, he died forgotten, cheated out of his greatest triumph by the very company he helped build into a racing legend. But that's just the beginning of what Ford v Ferrari got wrong, and what it got devastatingly right. Welcome to Fact versus Film, where we separate Hollywood magic from historical fact. I'm diving deep into Ford versus Ferrari, the 2019 racing epic that had audiences cheering for underdogs Carroll Shelby and Ken Miles as they took on the Italian racing giants. But how much of this automotive David versus Goliath story actually happened? You're about to discover that some of the film's most unbelievable moments are completely true, while other seemingly realistic scenes are pure fiction. And by the end, you'll understand why Ken Miles' real story is both more heartbreaking and more inspiring than anything Hollywood could invent. Let's start with what might be the biggest surprise. The corporate drama was real, but not in the way you think. Ford v Ferrari opens with Henry Ford II, played by Tracy Letts, desperately trying to buy Ferrari to save his company's aging image. This actually happened, but the film gets several key details wrong. First, it wasn't Lee Iacocca, played by John Bernthal, who led the negotiations. The real point man was Don Frey, a metallurgical engineer who actually impressed Enzo Ferrari so much that the Italian legend called him Dottore Ingegnere, Doctor Engineer. Enzo even doodled potential logos combining the Ford and Ferrari names, showing he was genuinely interested. The deal fell apart exactly as shown in the film. Enzo couldn't accept losing control of his racing team. But his reaction was even more explosive than what Christian Bale's character witnessed. According to Enzo's lawyer Franco Gozzi, Ferrari unleashed a tirade that I had never seen or heard before in my entire life, and have not done so since, calling Ford executives worthless sons of whores who made big, ugly cars for a pig-headed boss. Henry Ford II's response? Well, the film has him saying some pretty harsh things about Enzo, but his actual words were more controlled. All right, we'll beat his ass. We're going to race him. But here's where the film takes its first major creative liberty. That dramatic phone call to Fiat owner Giovanni Agnelli, warning him that Ferrari was about to be sold to Americans? Complete fiction. Fiat had been giving Ferrari money for years, simply as a thank you for making Italian cars look good on the world stage. And Fiat didn't actually buy Ferrari until 1969, 3 years after the events in the film. Matt Damon's portrayal of Carroll Shelby captures the Texans' legendary charm, but their first meeting with Ford executives is backwards. In the film, Iacocca approaches Shelby with a blank check. In reality, Shelby showed up at Ford's Detroit headquarters with a rehearsed pitch, asking for just $25,000 to build 2 cars that'll blow off the Corvettes. This gets us to our first major revelation. Shelby wasn't some outsider Ford discovered. He'd already been working with Ford since 1962, building the legendary Cobra Roadsters that were kicking Corvette ass on American racetracks. Ford's Total Performance program was already using powered by Ford badges on Shelby's cars. Even more impressive, Shelby's team had developed the Cobra Daytona Coupe, which in 1964 finished 4th at Le Mans behind 3 Ferraris and nearly won the whole thing. This car would go on to become the only American vehicle ever to win the International GT Championship. So when Henry Ford II called Shelby for the GT40 program, he wasn't taking a gamble on an unknown. He was calling in his secret weapon. Christian Bale's Ken Miles is the heart of the film, and thankfully, the character stays remarkably close to the real man. Miles really did drive tanks for the British Army during D-Day, really did run a struggling tuning shop in North Hollywood, and really was as brilliant behind the wheel as Bale portrays. But here's where the film's biggest fabrication begins. That supposed conflict between Miles and Ford racing director Leo Beebe. In Ford v Ferrari, Josh Lucas plays Beebe as an almost cartoonish villain who tries to ban Miles from racing. The truth? Miles raced at Le Mans in 1965, a full year before the events the film focuses on. He was paired with Bruce McLaren and retired due to gearbox failure, but Ford had no problem with him being there. The film shows Miles staying home in California during the 1965 Le Mans race, listening on the radio while dancing with his wife. Reality check, he was in France. driving for Ford and setting lap records before his car broke down. That dramatic scene where Shelby bets his entire business on Miles's success never happened. Shelby was a smart businessman who would never risk everything on a single race, no matter how much he believed in his driver. Here's something that will blow your mind. Ford v Ferrari completely skips Ford's first attempt at Le Mans in 1964. The film makes it look like 1965 was their debut disaster, but they actually failed spectacularly the year before too. Why cut this out? Probably because watching the same failure twice doesn't make for compelling cinema. But this omission hides something incredible: the technological revolution Ford was unleashing. The film shows Shelby's team working in a hangar with basic tools, using string taped to cars to test aerodynamics. While this happened, it's only part of the story. Ford was actually throwing cutting-edge 1960s technology at the problem. They used advanced engine dynamometers, basically computer-controlled torture chambers that could simulate the exact stresses of Le Mans. These machines would run engines until they literally exploded, then engineers would fix the problems and start over. The result was a bulletproof 427 cubic inch V8 that could survive back-to-back Le Mans simulations. They also used primitive computer programs to calibrate suspension systems. This wasn't some scrappy underdog story. This was a massive corporation with unlimited resources using every technological advantage available. Now for the races themselves, and this is where Ford v Ferrari gets surprisingly accurate in some ways and completely wrong in others. The 1966 Daytona race that opens the film's racing sequences, Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby didn't just win, they dominated, finishing several laps ahead of second place. That's almost 30 miles ahead in a race where every second counts. The film makes it look close for dramatic tension, but it was a blowout. But the film completely skips the 1966 Sebring race, which is a shame because it contains one of the most dramatic moments in racing history. Dan Gurney and Ken Miles were both driving hard, fighting each other instead of their opponents. Carroll Shelby had to signal both drivers to knock it off from the pit wall. On the final lap, when everyone expected Gurney to win easily, his car broke down. Instead of leaving it, Gurney started pushing his car toward the finish line, which got him disqualified. Miles won in a convertible GT40, and Gurney's engine failure actually helped the team, because Ford shipped the broken engine back to Detroit, analyzed what went wrong, and fixed the problem before Le Mans. And now we get to Le Mans 1966, where the film's biggest dramatic liberties either work brilliantly or completely miss the real story, depending on your perspective. First, the competition. The film shows a neck-and-neck battle between Ken Miles and Ferrari drivers right until dawn. The reality? By midnight, Ferrari's lead car was running in 12th place. Ford's real competition was internal. Dan Gurney in another Ford was actually leading the race until his engine blew 6 hours before the finish. The film shows Miles leading most of the race, but it was actually Gurney who set the pace until his retirement. Only then did Miles inherit the lead. That controversial photo finish? It's real, but more complex than the film suggests. With Ferrari out of contention and Ford running 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8th place, team management made the decision to slow all drivers down to ensure the cars would finish. This wasn't just Leo Beebe being difficult. Both he and Shelby agreed it was the smart play. Miles was indeed ahead when told to slow down, but he'd had to make an unscheduled pit stop to change brake rotors, allowing Bruce McLaren to catch up. The film doesn't show this crucial detail. Here's where the real story becomes more tragic than the film version. Initially, race officials said a tie finish would be allowed, and Miles would win because his car number was lower. Both drivers slowed down for the photo finish. But then came the devastating revelation. In case of a tie, the winner would be determined by starting position. Since McLaren started further back on the grid, he was technically declared to have covered more distance in the same time. Leo Beebe's reaction when he learned this rule? "Oh my God, that is not what we wanted at all. Is there any way we can protest this?" Ken Miles' response was heartbreaking in its professionalism. "I considered we had won, but we were placed second by a technicality. I feel the responsibility for this rests with the decision by Ford over my protests to make the finish a dead heat." Then he added, "Please be careful how you report what I have said. I work for these people. They have been awfully good to me." 2 months after Le Mans, Ken Miles was killed testing Ford's experimental J car at Riverside Raceway. The film shows him dying in a fire, but the real circumstances were different and more mysterious. Miles was ejected from the car at over 200 miles per hour when rear-end lift caused it to flip and crash. The exact cause was never determined, and given Miles's exceptional driving skills, many suspected the accident wasn't due to driver error. The controversy around his death adds another layer of tragedy to a man who gave everything to Ford's racing program. Perhaps Ford v Ferrari's biggest omission isn't any single detail, but the vast team that made Ford's victory possible. The film focuses on Shelby and Miles as lone wolves fighting corporate interference, but the reality involved hundreds of engineers, drivers, and support staff. Dan Gurney, the American racing legend who actually led most of the 1966 Le Mans race, barely appears in the film. The Advanced Vehicles Division in England, the Holman and Moody team, the aeronautics specialists, all reduced to background characters in favor of a simpler narrative. Even Carroll Shelby's own Daytona Coupe team, which won the International GT Championship while Shelby was focused on the GT40, gets ignored. These were the cars that proved American engineering could beat Ferrari on European tracks, setting up everything that followed. But let's give credit where it's due. Ford v Ferrari nails the emotional truth of this story. The racing sequences are absolutely authentic. The film used real cars, real racing, and no CGI for the track action. Those crashes you see? 7 cars really did fail to finish the 1966 Le Mans due to major accidents, many caused by rain that hit during the night hours. Miles really did have trouble with his GT40's door, because he'd bent it by slamming it on his own helmeted head. The brake fade problems were real and terrifying. The innovative pit stop strategy of changing entire brake rotors was Ford's secret weapon and shocked the racing world. Most importantly, the film captures Carroll Shelby's genuine grief over the photo finish decision. Years later, Shelby said, "I'll forever be sorry that I agreed with Leo Beebe and Henry Ford to have the 3 cars come across at the same time. Ken was 1.5 laps ahead and he'd have won the race. It broke his heart. Then we lost him in August." Ford v Ferrari takes place during a fascinating moment in automotive history, when American engineering was proving it could compete with European sophistication. Ford spent an estimated $25 million on their Le Mans program. Some estimates go as high as $100 million, making it one of the most expensive racing campaigns ever mounted. But the victory was complete. Ford didn't just beat Ferrari in 1966. They dominated Le Mans for 4 straight years. They drove Ferrari out of endurance racing entirely, forcing the Italian company to focus on Formula One instead. This brings us to the film's ultimate question: was it worth it? Ken Miles never got his moment of glory, dying just 2 months after his greatest achievement was taken away by a technicality. Carroll Shelby lived with regret over that photo finish decision for the rest of his life. But their work created some of the most legendary racing cars in history. The Ford GT40 became an icon, and Ken Miles' contributions to its development were finally recognized when Ford named their racing division after him decades later. Here's the detail that puts everything in perspective. At the moment Ken Miles was told to slow down for that photo finish, he wasn't just leading the race. He was on pace to lap every other car except his Ford teammates. His dominance was so complete that Ford management genuinely worried about embarrassing their competitors too badly. Ken Miles didn't just lose Le Mans on a technicality, he lost it while delivering one of the most dominant driving performances in racing history, in a car he'd helped develop from a dangerous liability into a world-beating machine. Ford v Ferrari may have taken liberties with the facts, but the emotional core remains true. This is the story of brilliant outsiders who revolutionized racing, only to be denied their moment of triumph by the very corporate machinery they served. Ken Miles deserved better from history, and thanks to Christian Bale's performance, he's finally getting the recognition that eluded him in life. The real story of Ford v Ferrari isn't just about cars or corporate rivalry, it's about the price of perfection and the tragedy of talent unrecognized until it's too late. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind Hollywood's biggest films, you've found your home. I dive deep into the real history behind blockbuster movies, uncovering the incredible true stories that are often more dramatic than fiction. Hit subscribe and join me as we separate fact from Hollywood fiction, because the truth is always more interesting than what makes it to the screen.